team has always has been reflecting on what it means to make and what maker culture means. And part of our event is our objective is to reflect and contribute towards making maker culture and making a little bit more diverse. And we have assembled a group of people, amazing people here to share their thoughts on this and to reflect together on what they think what direction maker culture should head towards. And so without further ado, I'll pass my mic to Pranay, who is our moderator today.
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. We don't have a lot of people here. I think it's the weather that's responsible. I'll blame that. It's a beautiful, beautiful Saturday morning outside. So thanks a lot for who's here. There's a slide deck there. Can you pull up? There's a slide deck with my name on it. But before we even begin, what is making? Making is something different for everyone, right? It's the act of building physical objects, coming up with an idea, designing it, fabricating it, and going out to a user and test it. You can build a simple thing like a 3D printed toy, or you can build a complicated robot with many, many moving parts inside it. Now, for many people, it's a hobby. But for some people, it's a life skill, and they have developed a profession around it. Over here in this panel today, we are looking at making as an empowering tool. We are looking at it as something that has really democratized this act of solving problems. You can solve your own problems. You can fix a tap in your home with making activities, but you can also solve problems of other people. And that brings us to the theme of this discussion. There are two things we are trying to discuss today. One is how can we use the skill that we have in making to solve problems such as accessibility, inclusivity, and sustainability, some of the most critical challenges the world is facing today. And the other theme is how can we make making itself accessible to everyone. So the format of the panel is very, very informal. We have a amazing panel lined up for you today. And each of us will talk about our own work, give our own introductions initially, and then we'll go into a short panel discussion, and we'll open up the floor for your questions as well. So I didn't introduce myself. My name is Pranay Jain. I am a PhD student in mechanical engineering, and I'm also a co-founder of a company called Squirrel Devices. At Squirrel Devices, we are enabling math and science accessibility for students with blindness. Now, the question that many people ask us is, what is assistive technology? Everyone working in the space of blindness, hearing disability, different disabilities says that we are working on assistive technologies. Now, by definition, assistive technologies are those products, physical objects, technologies, code, or anything that assists a person with disability to function as a person without a disability. For example, it lets a blind person cross the street. It lets people with physical disabilities move around without any dependence on someone else. It lets people communicate. Many people have disabilities which inhibit communication, and with technologies they're able to communicate freely with other people. And other examples are education, occupation, and daily living, and even entertainment. If you go to a movie theater, you'd see a sign of a microphone and a headphone that is assistive technology for people with hearing visual disabilities so that they can listen to the movie and also listen to a description of what's happening in a movie. But the essence of it is we are not really making technologies which are assisting persons with disability. We are making technologies which are empowering people with disability, empowering them to be a part of the regular society, empowering them to do activities on their own without depending on other people. So at Squirrel Devices, our mission was very simple. We are not trying to solve every problem in the world. We're trying to solve one problem that's affecting many people in the world. We are making accessible education, and that means inclusive education. So for people with blindness, I'll give you one example. If you're born blind, or if you go blind with age, it's usually expected that you'll do math and science till 8th grade, and you'll stop doing that afterwards. Most schools that serve people with blindness don't teach math and science after 8th grade. And that's because the subjects get complicated, they get very visual, and they get very, descriptive in a way that you can't just do without visual abilities. So at Squirrel Devices, we are solving these problems using simple products. So the first product we came up with, I would say 2 years ago, was a tactile caliper. It's not very well described in this image, but it's a simple measuring instrument. It's a geometry instrument that a student with blindness can use to measure with as much accuracy and precision as a sighted kid would do. The rulers that are there in classrooms right now would only let them measure in inches, but we were able to use these devices to let them measure in 1/16th of an inch or even 1 millimeter. And the reason I'm here today is this product, because we went from a pure undergrad engineer who doesn't know anything about technology really, to a product that's now selling across the globe. We have sold thousands in not just the United States, but across the world, and there are many people using it right now. And that's all because of our abilities in making. In the company that I'm running right now, we are also coming up with other products. We are coming up with other geometry instruments and other devices that will make education more accessible over time. That's all about me. I won't take all the time, and let's hear from other panelists. I'll pass on the mic to Juliana.
So should I stand? Well, thank you. It was a really nice technology to empower people. I really like it. And, excuse me. Well, my name is Juliana Miscavige. I'm from Brazil, and I'm doing my PhD in Sustainable Energy Systems through MIT Portugal program. And I'm here to do part of my research with D-Lab. And so I would just talk a little bit about my history before here. So before I came to D-Lab, I was developing a piece of technology that I thought would solve a clean energy problem and a sanitation problem in vulnerable communities. But then when I got here, I understood and I added this design and thinking value that D-Lab does have been doing for more than 15 years. And what happened is that my piece of technology cannot solve all the problems. And I just see that each community has their own problems and challenges that can be solved by them, not by us, not by like a foreigner person that just want to apply their technology there. Because with that, they just become dependent on this technology. They can't develop themselves. So the idea of D-Lab, the concept of D-Lab, and I think Sorin also is part of D-Lab as well, it's to empower people to co-create technology with them or by them. So the community itself developed their own technology. So I'm here to present some projects that I was part of, and then I will. Oh, okay, I have this. So I will talk about some, especially 3 main projects that I'm part with through D-Lab and actually outside D-Lab, but applying D-Lab methodology, which is in Nicaragua, Ethiopia, and Mongolia. And what I figured out after working in these 3 main regions, they are very different from each other, and in terms of values, culture, and way of living, and also the challenge that they are facing, that we need to focus in 3 main aspects to work with community, to involve the community, to have the community engagement. So one of them is how to build trust. I think trust is very important to build, not within the community, but also with our partners, our business partners, our co-workers. So to build trust in these communities, so what D-Lab does, it's like has a long-term relationship with all the communities since the beginning. They get to know each other. It's not only a long-term, but a personal relationship. So I made friends in these communities, and we've been working more than a year with them. So I think it's very important to build trust. And after that, the second key point and aspect is how to align expectations. And for example, in Nicaragua, we've been working for more than a year. I've been there 3 times, and we've been talking almost like every month with the COP of women that we're working with. and to align expectations, because as soon as we arrived there with a branch of MIT, they just thought that we're going to solve their problems like completely. And it's not our job to do this. So our job is to provide them all the tools and knowledge that they need to them to solve the problems. And so we have to really align the expectations, otherwise we can be frustrated and they can also be frustrated. And the third and very important one, they call, it's used to say about the cultural barriers, but in my opinion, it's not barriers. It's like how we can unite, how we can be united in different cultures. So D-Lab has been working with many countries, which has a lot of different values and religions and cultures. So how we can perceive ourselves inside of this new community, of this new culture. How we can be part of, how we can see each other without these barriers, but how we can unite it and how we can make difference. And talking about gender, and I'm the only woman here, so the gender imbalance still exists, and it's a big issue. And what we've been doing to overcome this challenge is it's not only empower women. Actually, D-Lab does this really in a really good way, because all the time the participants usually are 50% women and 50% men. So it's a really good thing. But, and additionally, I think it's not only to teach them how to use hands-on tools, but how to change the mindset. I think there is no reason just to give them tools, but they have to change inside them. Like not only women, but also men. So in Nicaragua, what we've been doing and what we realized that we have like a strong community of women that has been working in agriculture, but they are always talking about not invite men to work with them. And I think there is no gender discussion if you don't invite men to discuss with you. And it's not fight against gender imbalancing. I think there is no fight. It's all about discussion and dialogue. So we have to dialogue and bring together and work together to have this gender imbalance, to reduce these gender imbalances. And I think I've seen a lot in Mongolia as well. This, I don't know, are you a timekeeper? Okay, I will finish soon. So I think it's also very important to, for example, in Mongolia, they don't have, I think in Nicaragua, I think it's all about religion and this patriarchal society that the man has to do the hands-on work, the heavy work, and also about the political voice. Women in Nicaragua doesn't have like access to local water committees, but they are in charge of catching water and use the water actually. And in Mongolia, for example, there is no like religions. I mean, more than half of the population is not connected to any religion, but in general, there is this hierarchy thing that, and man is in the high position, so he takes the decision all the time. And Ethiopia, on the other hand, has like a strong connection with religion again, which is like, it's okay, but in that case, I mean, I completely respect, and we have to respect the religion context in this situation, but in a way that all the time, men wants not only to take the first step to do stuff, but they want to protect the women. They think they are fragile. They think they have to stay and just take care of the children and not do like, for example, let's say a male activity. So I think what I've been doing right now, I've been learning a lot with these female women cooperatives in Nicaragua, is that first we have to educate people, and it starts from childhood. So educating to changing so you have to empower people with ideology. So change this old system of patriarchism. And then you have to be organized. So you organize yourself to have voice, to be a leader. And then comes the economic empowerment that most of the researchers says that you empower women through money, through like economical empowerment. But I don't think this is the first step that we have to make. We have to make first the ideological empowerment, how to change our mindset, not only women mindset, but male mindset. And I will keep it short. Thank you. You all.
Thank you. Thanks, Juliana. So I didn't prepare any slides, but if you're online, maybe you can go to one of the websites I could point to, and that could give you some a picture of what I'm going to talk about. But my name is Sorin, and Juliana talked about maker skills and inclusivity in the maker movement. I want to talk to you about using maker skills to build sustainable businesses that have economic impact, and beyond that, actual social impact. So here's my story. When it comes to maker skills, I acquired them growing up in Romania. This was in the communist years, back in the 80s. And believe it or not, I didn't realize it then, but we had an awesome makerspace, an after-school program that allowed us to go and build rockets and boats and radios and whatnot. So I took to that very quickly. And it was a free after-school program, supplies were given, everything. And looking back now, it was a makerspace. We didn't call it that back then, but it was very popular, and I spent a lot of hours there and building all kinds of things, and that came in handy later. So now, fast forward 20 years, I come to MIT to do a graduate degree, and I run into a bunch of students that are working on some cool solar power projects in Africa. And this is what happens here every day at MIT. There's students working on all kinds of projects in the basements and labs and workshops of MIT, and that's exactly what these kids were doing. And they were looking for someone to help them kind of take the idea and build a business around it. So I said, okay, I had some business experience at this point, and I joined them to help build a business plan. And what we were working on, just to give you a sense, I don't think we have a picture here. We're working on these solar concentrators, parabolic mirrors that would harvest the sun's energy, turn it into heat, and then use that heat to create steam, and then we turn that, with that steam we turn an engine, and then we can create electricity and hot water for schools and and clinics in villages throughout rural Africa. And so the first thing we did, we had to build another prototype. We actually built one across the street here, just further down on Tang Hall in one of the parking lots. MIT gave us a space in the parking lot to build it. It was great. It was a lot of community participation, so to say. People were very encouraging of us doing that. And we went to Africa and built some more prototypes. And so very hands-on, very fun project. And at one point, someone said, hey, this works in Africa, but why can we do this in India? It's a bigger market. Maybe, they could use power and hot water in India as well. And I sort of said, okay, sure, let's try it. And we went ahead and wrote a business plan on how to take this technology to the Indian marketplace. Now, at this point, I had never stepped foot in India. So I wrote an entire business plan with just, hearsay and second-hand market research. We did have a lot of help from people that knew the market and locals and everything. So we had some knowledge of it, but it was good enough to actually get us second prize in a business plan competition back in 2007, which came with a whopping $10,000. And that was more than the money, is just a validation that maybe we're on to something, that this is possibly we can make a business out of it. So with $10,000, I went to India for the first time, and we looked to see who could use this contraption of ours. It's producing hot water, electricity. What can be better than that, right? And it turned out that not many people liked it. I mean, they didn't really care for it. They looked at it as like, yeah, okay, but here, my problem is I'm drying tea leaves. What do I do with this thing? So we were a classic case of a solution looking for a problem to solve. And I realized that in that trip that maybe we need to flip the whole concept backwards and look for a problem and designed a solution for that. Luckily, in that trip, we made a cold call to the managing director of a large dairy in India. And how many of you have been to India here? You know how important dairy is and milk is in Indian culture. It's absolutely essential. It's like the stuff of life. Everybody drinks it. It's used in almost every food item and also for religious rituals. So it's a really important part of the culture. And all that milk is collected from small individual farmers that have 1 or 2 cows in the village. They keep some of that milk for their own consumption, and the rest they sell it to a network of dairy processors. And it's actually good money. The farmers make good money from this milk. The milk costs maybe 80% of the price that consumers pay at the market for that milk actually ends up at the farmers, in the farmers' pockets. So milk is really valuable. And it turned out that a lot of that, what the managing director told us that day when we met him is like, but a lot of this milk spoils because it's very perishable. It takes only 5 hours for the raw milk. If you leave it out in the hot sun in India, it will turn into curd. You can't use it anymore. And that's a problem. Do you have a solution for that? And we're, well, not really. You're talking about refrigeration, right? Yes. Well, we only do hot water and electricity. So it was a completely new revelation for us that here's a problem that hasn't been solved, and we need to design a solution for that. So by the end of that trip, we basically gave up on our contraption of solar contraption and started focusing on this problem that we identified to chill milk, and dug deeper into it and realized that the problem is not really the lack of refrigeration, but there's a deeper underlying problem, and you might guess what it is. It's a lack of power infrastructure because they don't have regular power in a lot of these villages. It's not 24 hours a day like we have here or in most of US and Western Europe. So you can't run a business as a dairy processor collecting milk and trying to provide quality milk to your consumers if you don't have 24 hours or when you don't have power when you need it. And milk is a very time-based thing. Everywhere in the world, farmers milk their cows twice a day, morning and evening. And if you don't have power at that time, there's nothing you could do with the milk except to throw it out. So we realized that the power was the main problem. We went off and developed a system, a commercial refrigeration system that would chill the milk right there at the village collection point where the farmers bring it. It's a large industrial milk chiller. If you go to promethean-power.com, you may see a picture of that. Promethean, Promethean, not I, E-A-N. Promethean, E-A-N, not I, yeah. E-A-N, power, .com. So if you scroll down, you see what the system looks like. So it's an industrial refrigeration system that chills 1,000, sometimes 2,000 liters of milk. About 50 farmers will bring small amounts of milk to that collection point. It gets immediately chilled, and then within 24 hours, gets picked up and transported to a processing center when it gets turned into ice cream, yogurt, and other products that end up in the markets in the city. So the point that I'm trying to make, so this was the business part of it. We realized we can make a real business out of this. That who's buying this? It's the dairy processors, the companies that have a vested interest to buy this, and they suffer the spoilage and the quality, and so they have the money to pay for it. But the beneficiaries of this are the farmers themselves, because the farmers now can produce more milk, they get more money for their milk, they get a more regular check. So pretty soon we realized that it wasn't just about a sustainable business, sort of making money by selling these to dairy processors, but it's actually about the social impact that this could have. And that kept us going, at least personally kept me going for many, many years doing this. It wasn't an easy thing. It took us 10 years to actually get this kind of system commercialized and work in the company to actually be sustainable. But the social impact and seeing the farmers coming every morning and evening, delivering their milk, and it's like a festival atmosphere there at the collection center when they all come with, kids come with, 2 liters, 5 liters of milk. They all pour their milk, they sit around and chat, they exchange stories, this, that, and then they go back to their house. So it's a really nice environment, and seeing the impact that this could make really kept me going. I spent some time in India, actually. I moved there for a while to try to get this up and running. And so to wrap it up, I think sort of the maker skills, and now I look back all through my experience and things that I learned back in Romania, I ended up putting it here to use. Sort of boosted more by what I've learned here at MIT and continuing sort of the hands-on things. And I always encourage students, now I teach a class at D-Lab, as Juliana mentioned, and I always encourage students to look at putting their skills, the maker skills to use by building stuff that matters, stuff that's also sustainable as a business, because if you're a sustainable business, you make a bigger impact. The fact that we can have a profitable business allows us to hire more people, to train more people, to build more systems, and actually to deliver more and create a bigger impact. So that's my story, entrepreneurship and maker skills. I hope that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And we have some slides that you can put up. What I appreciate about all 3 presentations that you've heard is that they all have an underlying theme that is both social and technical. So we talk about assistive devices for the blind that has a social impact, as Juliana talked about, empowering women to make things. In order to develop an innovative device, you had to actually be in the culture and understand it in its social context. And in terms of this panel as the ethics of making, what I'd like to do is to take that point and now multiply it over a 50-year horizon. Just to anchor the conversation, first of all, good morning. Let me try it again. Good morning. Glad to have you all here. Personally, I became involved in making in only a small way. Most of my background and training is in the area of labor management relations and multi-stakeholder collaboration. I'm a social scientist, and so the making that I do is mostly making social systems. But when the first Fab Lab opened in the south end of Boston in 2003, my son and I, every Saturday for about 3 years, would volunteer at SETC. And so we got exposed to the early idea of a Fab Lab, a place where you go and design and make things. I taught for a number of years in the Engineering Systems Division here at MIT. And about 12 years ago, moved to Illinois. I became Dean of a School of Labor and Industrial Relations. And while I was there, I said, why don't we have a Fab Lab? And so what you see in this picture is the second oldest building on campus. It was an old horse stable. And they said, well, you can use that to put in a Fab Lab. So we had this very old building with this very modern technology. And the important thing that I want to emphasize about it is it took maybe 6 weeks to install the laser cutter and the electric knife and to set up the area for doing circuit boards and what have you. It took about 3 years to get the social system in place, the connection to the Boys and Girls Club, the connection to the community, getting the university to agree that part of the campus should be open to the community, and about 50% of the people using it are not part of the university. And that point of technology that moves at a very fast pace and social systems that move at a slower, more linear pace is in a sense the theme that we're going to keep coming back to. So if we go to the next slide, many of you have been in a Fab Lab. There's maker spaces, there's lots of different spaces in which people design and make things. But the important thing to emphasize, it's not just 3D printing, as many of you I'm sure know, and it is, in fact, a combination of different technologies that fill a room in which you can design and make anything. And if we go to the next slide, about 2 years ago, one of my brothers, Neil Gershenfeld, runs the Center for Bits and Atoms here at MIT. And my other brother, Alan Gershenfeld, is a leader in using video games to make the world a better place, games for change. And we were sitting around actually talking to our mother, who was suffering the advances of Alzheimer's, but she enjoyed hearing us talk. And in that context, we were talking about what Neil was doing with digital fabrication, and quickly became persuaded that with the technology he was right, but with the implications or the ethics for how we live, learn, work, and play, he wasn't going to get it right. And he needed the humanities and the social sciences, which in a sense his other two brothers represented. So on the left, you see Neil's roadmap. He starts with the analogy to computers. If we go back 50 years, there was one computer in the planet. Then we moved into room-filling computers, of which they were measured in the thousands. And then along comes the beginning of personal computing, initially hobbyists, and then later PCs measured in the millions. And then we move to computing devices, iPads and what have you, measured in the billions, and then we move to the Internet of Things, ubiquitous embedded computing, measured literally in the trillions. The important point is that that's a 50-year journey that led to a billion-fold increase in computing and communications capability. What got us into the book is that Fab Labs, if you go back to Moore's Law, he had a chart, most famous chart in history, with 5 data points showing a doubling every 18 months of computing capability. In his article in 1965, he said, well, if it goes for 10 years, amazing things were possible. In fact, of course, it's gone for 50 years. We're now 10 years, or about 12 years, into the Fab Lab digital fabrication maker journey. And we're right at the same space as computers filling rooms, Fab Labs filling rooms. Those computers cost about $100,000 and weighed 2 tons. A Fab Lab cost about $100,000 and weighs 2 tons. And the important thing is that we're starting to see the emergence of going from community fabrication to personal fabrication, to devices that you have access to on a more distributed basis. And on the horizon, in fact, if you go into his lab, we see the emergence of digital materials and even programmable materials that have the potential to be distributed in the millions, billions, and even trillions in terms of literally anyone being able to make anything, people owning the means of production. So the story that I'm going to tell is around 3 ethical challenges in that roadmap. And they are access, literacy, and safety and security. So we'll start with the first one. I'll go pretty quickly through them, but let's go with the first one with next slide, which is access. In 2015, then President Obama said access to the internet is not a luxury, it's a necessity. You need it for health information, for job information, for civic engagement. This is 50 years after Moore's Law, almost to the day. Waiting 5 decades to put access on the table means that we have digital divides that are now pervasive. Yes, this chart on the left shows that half the world's population has access to the internet, but mostly it's with handheld devices that you can't do CAD/CAM programming and what have you. And so the basic issue of access, a digital divide, is out there, and the risk is 10 years into it, if we don't raise the issue of access to digital fabrication, we could in 50 years be saying, you know, it's a necessity, not a luxury. That's waiting too long. So the first point I want to make is the conversation about access with digital fabrication is now, not 40 years from now. Let's go to the next slide. Literacy turns out to be complicated. This is the curriculum for Neil's course on how to make almost anything. And it turns out it's really hard to learn how to use all of the different pieces of equipment. They're not fully interoperable. The software is complicated and challenging. I have some pictures in the middle of 3D printers going amok and laser cutters blowing up. And so if you don't know the properties of materials, the right settings, things can go wrong. And so there's some basic literacy issues for which we still have a ways to go such that people can easily learn how to design and make things. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about safety and security. Sadly, this is a picture from the Fab Lab in Grenoble, France. 2 months ago, a pair of anarchists firebombed the lab. It was a shock to the whole. There are over 1,000 Fab Labs in the world. There's an equal number of maker spaces. And institutions, which is what I study, have to do two things. They have to create value and mitigate harm. 95% of the energy in the maker world, in the Fab world, is around creating value. Very little of the conversation is around mitigating harm. So when this happened, people said, you know, it was an unusual event. In fact, the anarchists in Grenoble were hard on the people that did this because they said you picked the wrong target. Fab Labs are actually open to the community and dedicated to making technology accessible. There were other instances of technology that you could have protested. But if we go to the next slide, the issue is still, if we go to the next slide, people do worry. Will people use a Fab Lab to make weapons? Well, we've talked to people in Fab Labs around the world, and it is true that the first thing a kid might do is to want to make a knife. And at the Fab Lab in India, the second oldest one in the world, they said this happens all the time, and they coach kids to say, we don't do that here. But if the digital fabrication technology moves and becomes more accessible, you won't necessarily have that community context of the norms to govern that. And so that is a 3D printed Magnum pistol that you see there. I'm actually less worried about that because Fab Labs often exist in very conflictual places. There was 2 labs in Ireland built in the Peace Wall, in Derry and in Belfast. And Protestants and Catholics would come together and be focused on designing and making things, and the past kind of receded, and the present, shared present, became more important. They're now putting Fab Labs in Colombia to help with the reintegration of the FARC. There are Fab Labs in the Middle East and in other places where people design and make things, and the magic is not so much what they make, but the process of the shared making. And so in that sense, there are some real norms that happen at the community level. But if the roadmap is right and we move to personal computing, we don't have that. And what's even more scary, I put this biohazard sign up there because increasingly we see people experimenting. You see a little bit of it around here with biofab. And as a society, the institutions that are in place to deal with mitigating harm for biofab are mostly medical ethics review panels, which just aren't up to the task. Again, a linear social system with an accelerating exponential technology, that's the challenge. Let's do one more slide, which is, it's hard to see with the light, but this is a scene from Star Trek where Captain Picard is asking for his Earl Grey tea hot, and the machine produces something other than tea. It turns out the machine had a corrupted bug in it. And on the one hand, Neil's roadmap is all about ultimately building the Star Trek replicator, programmable materials. But when we talk to people in the Fab ecosystem, they said that's not always a perfect ideal because it's the image of a black box of technology in which there isn't human agency. There isn't the ability to shape the technology. Captain Picard did not know how to fix the machine that he was depending on. He hadn't made it. He didn't know how it worked, and it was a crisis for at least 20 minutes. And so part of this is, can you build into the technology not only the ability to make incredible things, but the ability to have governance and influence that's part of the assumption that's associated with the technology. So for the last slide, what I have up here is the Fab Charter. This is as close as there is to governance in the Fab system, a set of rules and principles that people have articulated, but there's all sorts of questions that aren't addressed. Who makes decisions? How are disputes resolved? How are things done? We have a lot of government regulations about safe workplaces, but Fab Labs don't count as a workplace. So in a sense, the work of fabrication and making falls through the cracks of the existing systems in society that are designed to prevent harm. And in some sense, we don't necessarily want all of that regulation, but we do want systems of input, governance, and control that are oriented to a distributed ecosystem. And so what I want to do is, in a sense, put on a challenge to say that access, literacy, and safety and security are all ethical challenges in which we need the social systems that pair with the technical systems. The last slide is we did a global survey of people in the digital fabrication movement, and we asked them, among other things, to say, well, what's a word or phrase that you would use to describe digital fabrication and what it represents? And we just picked the phrases that we liked, and then we looked at what country they came from, and it turns out they were, of course, from all over the world. But I'll leave that up as the last slide, in a sense, the voice of people from around the world who are inspired and motivated by the spirit of digital fabrication. And the challenge that I'll put on the table is, can we have technical systems that are exponential, co-evolving with social systems that can also operate in the same way? Thank you very much.
We do indeed have a really good panel over here. One again, an applause for the panel. So we have around 15 minutes with us. I'll take around 10 minutes to have a discussion with the panel, and we'll open up in the last 5 minutes for questions that you might have. So the three panelists here gave presentations on their work, and one thing that I found really common about all they have discussed is making as a culture, as an activity, as a skill, is something that is very democratic. You don't really need an engineer anymore, a person who's really expensive and skilled, to build anything. And that brings us to people. So, Joel, in your book, Designing Reality, and that book is co-authored with Neil and Alan, your two brothers, you talk about fabrication divide. We talk about making, and we think of it as something that's very democratic, as something that anyone can go to, everyone can use. But is it really the reality? And what is your perspective on it?
So thank you. Right now, the exciting thing is we see Fab Labs and maker spaces happening in inner cities, in remote rural Alaska, in remote India, in lots of different places. So in that sense, the technology is widely distributed. On the other hand, there is a real risk of a fabrication divide similar to the digital divide. Some of it is this basic threshold issue, access to the internet, and some of it is the educational issues of riding up the learning curve. The exciting thing is the people who aren't necessarily MIT students, but who show up in these labs in rural communities are as good as the best of MIT students, and they are taking these online how to make anything kinds of classes and doing amazing stuff. So the ability to bridge the digital divide is there, but I think it now moves into a policy issue. Just last week in the House and the Senate, a bill was introduced in the US Congress calling for a national network of Fab Labs, making digital fabrication and, in a sense, the digital divide a policy goal. It doesn't have funding, it just has aspirational language, but it has sponsorship from both Democrats and Republicans. And the idea of being locally self-sufficient but globally connected seems to cross the digital divide. And so the idea is there, the potential's there. Do we have the will to make it work?
Thanks, Joel. That also reminds me, in Juliana's presentation, she was talking a lot about gender and poverty and aspects, cultural aspects that we come across when we see other countries. And right here, sitting at MIT, we are really not looking at a good sample set of people who are into making. And if we have to introduce other people into making, we have to work with them. And that also reflects in what you are talking about. There is a resistance from someone to something new. So how do you overcome, Juliana, how do you overcome these challenges when you go to these very widely different geographies?
Thank you. In my opinion, I think what we've tried to do is to build this trust environment. And how do you do that? You get together people that has at least the same age or the same values or the same, for example, you don't, in these places you don't gonna put some like professors with students because the hierarchy think we're gonna low down the discussion. So first you build this similar environment, so a group of women and a group of men, and then they feel more comfortable and they agree more with their opinion, and they came up with one single opinion, and then they discuss as a big group. So you are not talking about yourself, you're talking about as a group, so you have much more like welcome to discuss different things and also to build stuff. So usually what we do, like in a hands-on environment, we first put women to work with women, and then they feel confident to ask them help, and then we mixed the gender, for example, and then we say, oh, and then when we see that, so we work as a design facilitators, so we ask them, can you help this lady, or the lady we ask, lady, can you help this man? And then we have a synergy that everyone can bring their own knowledge, even if it's not hands-on knowledge, but maybe like a delicate thing or like a supportive approach to help the interaction of all genders and all type of people, even if they are not feeling welcome. So that's usually what we do.
Thank you, Juliana. Actually, there's so much we can learn from your work. And it also reflects on, Joel said that it took 6 months to set up the workspace, but it took 3 years to get the students and get the authorities in place to get things actually running. And that also reflects when you're doing a business, right? So, Sorin, in your case, you came up with a technology and you went to India and Africa and so many different places, and you completely changed it. Threw it out of the window and come with something new. And that involves working with people on problems they have. So it's not always that we need to empower people to solve their own problems, but we, in our case especially, are like aliens in other lands where we are trying to solve problems which we don't personally encounter. So what are some of the biggest challenges you came across and you see other students coming across when they go to solve problems that are not their own?
That are not there.
Problems that are not their own.
Oh, the problems that are not their own. Yeah, so I guess the first thing that comes to mind is this concept of immersion. So immersing yourself in the problem. And, you know, when we first started the company, Promethean, I was doing this, I was based here in Boston. I would travel back and forth to India and spent significant amount of time there, 2-3 months at a time. But I would always come back here and, you know, reset and then go back a few months later. And things didn't really go that well. I mean, the company didn't make a lot of progress. We missed a lot of targets, and we basically didn't really understand the users. And at some point, I convinced my wife to go give up her job and let's move to India. And I think there's a little nudging from the investors too, because they were like, things are not going so great. Maybe you should move to India. I was like, okay. So I moved to India. And once I found myself in that environment, I was able to much better understand the needs of the users. I spent a lot of time in the villages and installing the systems and staying there for a few days, overnight, watching it, how it performs, morning, evening, all that stuff. And, you know, talking to them and just observing how they interact with the system sometimes, what's the feelings that they have about it, where they struggle with in using it. So just sometimes being a fly on the wall just to see the system in operation really helped a lot, because we made a lot of improvements to it. We iterated very fast, so within 3 years we had a whole new system, a whole new design, and we were able to then become a commercial and profitable company a little bit later. So I think immersion, that's one thing that I tell a lot of students here at MIT too, is that if you want to do a lot of work in developing countries, it's great, because that's where the needs are, and it's really rewarding, and it's a lot of fun too. It's an adventure, but you want to be able to immerse yourself there. You can't really do this remotely, kind of going back and forth, sort of, you know, dipping your toes in it for a little bit, coming back here. At some point you have to think about spending significant amount of time, and you don't have to move there per se, like I did. I mean, you could do it for a while, like maybe temporary arrangement where you spend, you know, 6, 7, and 12 months at a time, but like really absorbing that culture is important. So. Anyway, that's my take on it. I think it's valuable, very valuable skill, and it's a lot of fun too.
So thanks, Serene. It's outstanding when you actually solve problems that are not your own, and In my particular case, I work on things for people with blindness, and people keep on asking me, like, is there someone in your family who's blind, or do you know some person who's blind, and that kind of motivated you, and that didn't happen. You don't have to be in the problem to realize the problem. Sometimes you can be a complete outsider, and that was your case, and that's your case as well, where you go from a person from Portugal going to Ethiopia to create communities. So one thing that always strikes up, and many people ask that question, is about resources. So making is not a cheap hobby or skill. You need materials, you need money, you need human capital as well, you need machines. So working in all these different geographies and communities, what were these resource challenges that really all three of you came across? You came across in universities, you came across that in India, and other students came across in different places, and you certainly have been in all geographies. So your comments on resources and access to resources in these areas.
I was offering you the chance to start, but I'll make just a quick comment, which is that in Fab Labs and makerspaces, the technology is moving very fast, but the raw materials, the plastics, the cardboards, and the powdered metals, the consumables, is in fact, I think, the biggest constraint in the system. I would highlight two things that I see on the horizon. One, there's a woman in Brazil, in Santiago, Chile, who has started a website on the properties of local materials that you can use in making. And her point is that instead of going around the world to import these plastics and other things, there may be resins in trees or sand in a desert or other materials near you, and increasing the ability to use local materials in fabrication allows you to move more towards a circular economy. On the horizon, with digital and programmable materials, then the materials start to get reused and you can imagine a world where once raw materials are mined and put in digital, in modular form, they can be used and reused in many ways. And then we really cut through the crisis of consumable materials. The mayor of Barcelona 3 years ago, when they had the annual Fab conference there, they do it in different cities around the world, announced that in 40 years he wanted his city to be able to make what it consumes. He said, right now we're just a transition belt of products into garbage, and people use them a little in between, but mostly the city produces garbage. He said, we should be able to reuse materials and be globally connected, but locally self-sufficient. And a number of cities and even some countries have now signed this Fab pledge to be on this journey of self-sufficiency, and it's all about the materials.
It's true, and I'd love to see some of these programmable materials. The thing that I came to mind when you said that, it's more about, it's also about education and getting access to these makerspaces. So we take it for granted here in the United States, and particularly here at MIT, that we have so many labs and so many workshops and things we can do, but it's not the same everywhere. And particularly in India, I found that the students coming out of the best schools at IIT, Indian Institute of Technology, their dream was not necessarily to start a company and make something. It was maybe to go work for a big multinational and get a big paycheck. And they've made it at that point. They've got, everyone will be proud of them. The family would be proud of them. But that's changing, and that's because the the schools in India are also starting to create a lot more maker environments. So IIT Delhi, where I spent some time, and you spent some time, you can speak about it. It's starting to change, and now students are coming out of thinking, oh, actually, I can make a business out of, start a new business, be an entrepreneur, and develop things within the school environment before I graduate. So I start seeing that change. I think the mentality is changing, and I hope it continues that way. I don't know if you may want to add anything to that, but I think it comes to education. Like, how can we get that early? And you probably, from you being a professor, how do you get that mentality early on, and then it creates the sea change.
Yeah, I agree with both of you, and I think, at least what we do in International Design Development Summit, under D-Lab approach, is like we plan before, so we get to know the community and what are the resources, But I think one really important point is creativity. So people on the ground has like such an amazing creativity, and they create things and they improvise a lot. So we learned a lot from them because of that. So usually what we do is always working with local materials, and if it's really, really hard to find something there, we bring it with us, but usually they came up with a lot of interesting ideas to replace some materials that we don't have locally. And I think it's all about creativity, and in terms of like personal resource, which is also like a costly thing, we train trainers, like local trainers, because they know the community already, they know the cultures, the values. So what we do is like we train local people to become trainers and to keep doing their work.
That's great. We really see a lot of resources. It's not just money, it's not just creativity, it's materials, and every aspect is a limiting factor. It kind of reminds me of the Lebesgue's law. It kind of reminds me of that Lebesgue's law of minimum, which says that resources are like stakes in a barrel. The smallest stake in the barrel determines how far you can go in anything. So with that, we'll open questions in the audience. And do we have questions? Sure, go ahead.
I completely agree that we should spread more Fab Labs around the world, but a really good way for you to sell this to a possible investor is to give the very best examples of solutions that came out from Fab Labs, and I would like you to share some of the good examples that these Fab Labs have brought to society.
So first of all, in terms of selling to investors, increasingly Fab Labs can make Fab Labs. That is, you can use the equipment to make your own equipment, and so there's multipliers in the system that don't necessarily involve investors. At the same time, just like Andrew Carnegie introduced, he did some terrible things as a capitalist, but as a social entrepreneur, he introduced the idea that every town should have a library, which was not an assumption. And increasingly, I think every town should have a makerspace, a fabrication space, and that would take, investment. So yes and no on that. But what I would say is that you can find amazing examples of prosthetic devices, of furniture, of houses, of all sorts of things that people will make in a Fab Lab. And increasingly, the technology will get to the point where you can make industrial quality goods. It's not quite there for many goods, for some it is. But I actually think that's not the most important product today. If you go to the city of Pittsburgh, it was a dying steel town, and 10 years ago, educators started having pancake breakfast saying kids aren't learning the way they used to. And what they realized is that it wasn't just every generation saying this, but the importance of what you guys do, project-based learning, was something that generationally was of increasing importance. Over 17 breakfasts, I think it was, ultimately over 1,000 people got into this conversation, and what they've built is a whole ecosystem of makerspaces and Fab Labs, over 100 of them in K through 12, in community college, Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and increasingly that region has now become a center for robotics. And it's not by accident. It's because there's digital design literacy that is built into the whole education system over a decade that then enables a reinvention of a region. And so I think the ability to learn to design and make things is as much a product as the physical objects.
Yeah, I think it's a much more delayed effect. You're not going to see the instant success and everything, but like you say, over many decades, you'll see this sea change and mentalities and skills that people acquire that maybe many years later will do something great.
More questions? Sure.
So for me, when I got here, I'm from an island called Saipan, and we didn't have a lot of stuff. And when I came here, I was like, wow, you guys have so much stuff here to just make stuff. And I was wondering what kinds of technologies are like the minimum stuff you need to just kind of start up a makerspace, such as 3D printing or 3D graphics software like SolidWorks. What are the minimum stuff we need to start a makerspace?
So I think that's a great question, and let me explain why. So in rural India, the very second Fab Lab is in a very small remote region in which he said increasingly in a village, one person might buy one piece of equipment, a laser cutter, another might buy a 3D printer, and none of them have the resources to set up a whole fabrication, but across 2 or 3 villages working together, they have a kind of virtual Fab Lab in which people can make things. So in that sense, the entry is at the equipment by equipment level. There are models like that out there. In inner city Detroit, there's a fellow, Blair Evans, an MIT alum, who is setting up a big central lab with small satellite labs to help this area that's just economically devastated design food, hydroponics, and housing to help sort of, meet local needs. But the most important reason why I think your question is interesting, my brother Alan developed a video game to preserve local culture on the northern slopes of Alaska, working with the Inuit peoples. It's a game called Never Alone, in which each time you accomplish a new level, it releases a story from the elders. It's a fascinating game. But in being up there, he started the conversation with Fab Labs, and they now have a central lab, and they're building other ones. And what's interesting to me is that in rural Alaska, much like Saipan, where you're from, getting spare parts for machines is difficult. Get the ability to make things, in one sense, for 3,000 years, that was a sustainable culture that didn't depend on trade from anywhere. In the last 80 years, it's become dependent on Western goods of various kinds, but there aren't as many barriers of regulation and other things to them moving back to a more sustainable model. And so I actually think we might see the most growth in remote rural areas where the need is greatest. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have, and where there are fewer barriers, and where also there are ancient traditions of barter and exchange that are consistent with the ability to make things. So I would say that if you pair this advanced technology with ancient cultures, and you get something very exciting that becomes possible.
Just to add on that, I think in terms of technology itself, you don't need much, in my opinion, to have a make space. Just a hacksaw and a drill, you can get together all this stuff and build stuff. So you don't need, I think it's really important, like 3D printers and so on, but if you think in Ethiopia, for example, in a very rural community, you don't need this to build stuff. Communities are still building a lot of stuff without any like high-tech technology. So.
Questions?
Hi, this is a super fascinating panel. Thank you for holding it. I have a little bit of experience building out Fab Labs and a bit of experience with other hackerspaces, and there's a big tension that I think speaks also to the advance of technology exponentially and the linear social change. And that's sort of embodied in the difference between a place like a tech shop, where there's a Kinko's model of sort of paying for time on a machine that you can't own, and Fab Lab, which is has a lot more ideology behind it, but is nominally much more open. Fab Lab kind of operates on a premise that might be unproven, that it is universally agreed that knowing how things are made is intrinsically good. A lot of people I encounter who aren't in this room don't really feel that they need to know how to make the case of the cell phone or understand all the workings. How do you reconcile the social differences in the culture that comes up around a make space and the culture that comes up around a more ideologically driven space like a Fab Lab?
I don't want to always be the first to respond, but boy, you put your finger on a crucial issue that Within the Fab Lab community, you have the advantage of a common technology footprint, as you say, a common ideology of valuing how things are made, and people are also digitally connected. So there's an ecosystem there. And it's different than a tech shop, which is more of a franchise model, different than a makerspace, which has a lot more variation in terms of what technology are we talking about. And when you talk about fab divides, there are divides of mindsets. You talked about the importance of mindsets, and those different communities are emerging different mindsets. And in one sense, if they diverge more and more, it makes it harder to have the collective impact that is possible with this digital fabrication, but nor should it be there's only one way to do it. And so you need these mechanisms for crosstalk, for boundary spanning, for bridging, so that communities don't spin off into separate directions. Right now, it's still an ecosystem in which there is sort of certain norms of goodwill that prevail. And if you think back to the 1970s and 80s, before the opening up of the internet, there was that same kind of norm. And then along comes big business and certain other forces, and we now get to a world of weaponized social media and all these other things. And that's because we didn't have these conversations back then. And so I think the early hints that you see of people thinking and acting differently is just the tip of the iceberg of how things could go south. And so we have the advantage of having seen that lesson happen with digital communications and digital computation. Can we do better with digital fabrication? I think you put your finger on a profound ethical challenge in this space.
Thanks a lot for coming today. Another round of applause for Juliana, Sorin, and Joel. And thank you for the really lively discussion. It was great.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I hear a lot of questions are about the local context and the cultural dimensions of making. I'd like to draw attention to our panel at 1 p.m., which is making perspectives from across the globe. We have a speaker from Nepal, from Kakana, who is one of the innovators of frugal maker spaces and maker education. They draw from their own local resources and the coaches in their grassroots organization. They'll speak more about this. And Andana will be speaking about Jugad, a kind of a Indian version of making, but not really, but learning from local context of what it means to make. Ron will be speaking about African spaces, and so will Julia Manuri. For people who are interested in these issues, pleased to come. I also want to draw attention to the Victorian refurbished camera there. It's super fun. Maddie has done an amazing job with the camera. Do check it out. Thank you so much, guys.